And we'll get going. Alrighty. So my name is Juliet Cook. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Health and Sustainability Officer for the Graduate Architecture, Landscape and Design Student Union, or GALSU, at the University of Toronto. Oh, sorry. It just started playing the YouTube back to me. Don't need that right now. I'd like to introduce the rest of the team who will be joining me in hosting tonight. We have Curtis Chen, Randa Omar, and Zoe Bedford. So thank you for joining us for the second What's Next session of 2021. This series aims to provide students with some insight to the career steps that various alumni have taken to arrive at where they are today. I will now read our land acknowledgement. We wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, the digital space and conceptual place that we are meeting in, as well as the meeting place of Toronto, are still the home of many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on this land. While we recognize that not everyone is sharing the same space during this time, we encourage each of you to take the time to think about, learn, and reflect upon where you are and the Indigenous peoples who have lived there, are currently there, and the future generations who will live there. As people living on this land, it's essential for us to reflect the ethos and respect that the Indigenous communities have shown towards the land and towards each other. We must show support through our actions, not just our words, for those of us who are occupying this land. I would just like to mention a few housekeeping notes. As you've noticed, we've chosen not to use the webinar format, and this is to foster a more interactive environment. We'd like to remind you to remain muted during the presentation, and there will be an opportunity for everyone to engage in dialogue afterwards. If you would like to ask a question, you can send it to either myself, Randa, Curtis, or Zoe privately, or post in the chat, and we will take incoming questions in chronological order. And with all of that said, I'm going to introduce our speaker for tonight, Drew Adams. So Drew is a designer with a background spanning architecture, landscape architecture, and urban design. He's an associate at LGA Architectural Partners in Toronto with nearly 10 years experience leading innovative and high-profile public interest design projects. This includes affordable housing projects like Eva's Phoenix to the Evergreen Brick Works carbon-neutral Kiln Building, while his own speculative work has been distinguished in numerous international design competitions. This work has received recognition ranging from the Mies Crown Hall America's Prize nomination to Material Innovation Awards and publication features ranging from Fast Company to Architectural Record. Drew recently co-authored a series for Azure on design and climate change, is a frequent speaker and guest critic, and occasional adjunct professor. Drew is the 2011 recipient of the Irving Grossman Prize and was named recipient of the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada's Emerging Architect Award in 2020. With all of that said, I'm going to pass the mic over to Drew. Welcome.
Thank you. I want to start by extending my gratitude for being invited to share tonight and for everyone who's joined to listen. Understanding this to be a conversation about my career path from graduating to present through my work, I thought the title, How Would I Be, What Would I Do, was fitting more so from the perspective that I hope to focus on a preoccupation of sorts with how our work affects people's lives and affects the planet and our agency in that. And because I lifted it from the Buckminster Fuller quote, if success or failure of this planet of human beings depended on how I am and what I do, how would I be, what would I do, which has kind of guided my mindset in a lot of ways for a while. I've roughly divided this presentation into kind of three sections, exploring other ideas, affecting people and the planet, and what's next. I started at Daniels in 2007, the fall of 2007, having studied urban planning with a minor in geography and taking probably more landscape restoration and ecology courses than MLA students will take during their studies. I also joined the faculty with about a dozen or so peers from the planning program, split between architecture and landscape, and often found myself bouncing between the studios and often found myself tagging along to my landscape architecture peers lectures that seemed interesting, like on Capability Brown and others. That said, I also found my first couple of weeks of my time in studio quite frustrating, working on this rope assignment, which at the time I did not understand the purpose of whatsoever. It was too abstract and outside my comfort zone, but it quickly kind of taught me to learn to trust the process. After that, I really leaned into the interdisciplinary nature of the school and looked at kind of back and forth between studio projects and using them as springboards for competition entries to kind of explore other ideas. And so here on the left is one of the earlier projects like that. We were mapping the San Francisco Bay Area in studio, looking at the edge condition and culminating in a ferry terminal project for the final project. But in doing this work, what I became particularly interested in is in this top center image and more into the top right image is the way that the sea level rise was very quickly inundating the San Francisco Bay's delta and the San Joaquin Valley and watershed, which itself is responsible for nearly 50% of all US food and fruit and vegetable production and sits 3 times lower than New Orleans. And so this work and some other work that we were looking at the time led to my longtime friend and collaborator, Fadi Massoud, who's director at the Center of Landscape Research at the University of Toronto. He and I entered this competition for the International Rising Tides competition with our entry about rising tides as the Delta Stupid. And we got an honorable mention. And this was one of a series of projects like this where work was happening in studio. And either in collaboration or independently, I was looking at leveraging these to keep exploring these ideas and use competitions to kind of push development of graphic skills and kind of skills working on project narratives. This work, to my surprise, quickly started getting published and didn't help, or sorry, didn't hurt in terms of getting summer jobs. What was also something that stood out is at the time, Ian Chodikoff, then editor of Canadian Architect, had remarked during a presentation he was giving that often the editors and writers of these publications were looking for things to write about, and he had encouraged us to write out. And so a number of these publications and others resulted from that, including the one in the middle where I had wrote to Christopher Hume of the Toronto Star, challenging a few things he wrote about the ability to fix the suburbs. And I found myself 2 days later on the receiving end of a phone call from him. And 2 days after that, with some of my work in the Star, and a lesson to be much more prepared if I'm going to write someone like that, for being able to kind of answer questions on the spot to continue to substantiate my positions that I was making. This lecture by Cameron St. Clair, editor of Architecture for Humanity, while I was a student, a founder of Architecture for Humanity and editor of the book Design Like You Give a Damn, left a fairly significant imprint on me. He delivered it at OCAD on when being sustainable is a matter of survival. And this lecture happened at the time that the housing market was collapsing in the US in particular, and followed by the global recession. I spent the next several semesters at Daniels co-opting my studio assignments to focus them towards my own interests that was building up to my thesis in looking at the suburbs, zoning, and low-rise high-density housing typologies. Sorry for these kind of things jumping on the screen. It's the Zoom controls keep popping in. And so this work in studio started to feed into my thesis work, looking at opportunism in the zoning and building codes to inform development of a series of loopholes, essentially, to inform development of a series of housing prototypes targeting areas of the city often cast aside as undevelopable for lack of sufficient performance. On the left, working on proof of concepts. On the right, starting to deploy these along my 6-kilometer long thesis site. It was a corridor site, so along it and adjacent to it, scaling that up to the regional scale of the Toronto area, looking specifically at these pink areas and essentially everything outside of the downtown core, but these pink areas specifically as sites for low-rise high-density intensification. And in doing this work, what I was able to project and forecast at the densities through testing was that you could build out all of these sites and accommodate all the future projected population growth at the time for Ontario and places to grow without building anything more than a 6-story building, recognizing that we're still going to build condos like we always do at the same time. After graduating Daniels, I joined Barrett Sampson Ewart Architects, worked on quite a number of different projects, but in particular, this one on the left is one that left a mark on me. It is a demonstration, a carbon neutral demonstration housing project in Yellowknife that we did a big design report on I had the opportunity to fly up a few times. And while working that, I was simultaneously working with a few friends on this competition entry on the right for net zero affordable housing in San Francisco, proposing a scheme that was 85% less energy than typical, 90% less water use through water use reuse on site, and that was proposed as a 13-story skip-stop hybrid mass timber building that we ended up being one of the winners in. After my time at Bear Simpson Newark, I joined LGA Architectural Partners almost 8 years ago now, and found myself on the design team for this project, Eva's Phoenix, which is a 50-bed youth transitional housing center downtown. For the organization Eva's Initiatives, which is a fantastic organization and highly recommend you all look up. This project is an existing waterworks warehouse that the City of Toronto owned. It is, at the time, was underutilized and given over for Eva's, and then also the remainder of it to be redeveloped. The project intentionally was discrete from the street, not to announce the program contained within. This space, this is the space before, it's a heritage designated space. And this wall on the left actually bisected the two halves of the warehouse, which were then stitched together like this. This is after completion. This street, the main idea is this street down the middle, wash and daylight, lined with a series of houses shared by a series of roommates, each with their own private bedrooms. This project was informed a lot by conversations with the youth and other engagement. And as much as that shaped it, this daylight study on the left further refined some of the massing in this atrium. So on the left, you see these rainbows are light and going into these bedrooms compared to this code minimum bedroom in the middle here, which was light getting into these bedrooms in the upper level, which is the building permit was contingent on. And as we started to work on this, or as we developed this project, what you start to see here is these kind of semi-public street stoop conditions at the periphery of this kind of street condition. Going into the interior of these houses, this would be on the left, the living room shared amongst housemates, a kind of semi-private condition overlooking and engaging with the street itself, or this idea of the street. Open stair rising up to an open overlooking corridor on the second floor, and the private, individual private bedrooms also on the second floor, the most private area of the building. This kind of crafting and attention to these transitions is critical for the project in allowing the youth to choose their level of participation on any given day in the shared collective life of the building. There's a lot more about how this project was formed that you can find online by Googling, or I invite you to reach out to me. I'm not going to get into much more details on many of the projects I'll talk about. But what this project kind of drives home in my mind is that the fundamental questions about housing today are not about height restrictions or zoning changes. Important as these questions can be, the core issues are what and whom housing is for, whom it oppresses and whom it empowers. And this is what Dave Madden and Peter Marcuse write in Defense of Housing. One of the next kind of major buildings along my career path here was the Evergreen Brick Works Kiln Building, which is the largest building on the Evergreen site. It was left open air, unconditioned, exposed to the weather since the site was redeveloped. This is the space kind of built out afterwards. The floor was raised. There's these minimal intervention at the edge with these handrails, a lot of infrastructure to enclose the building and make it a kind of events and community use space. We really looked at a kind of restrained intervention approach, these very small incisions in some of the existing fabric, but very minimal demolition, these kind of fine-tuned details between the new floor and the kilns. See that more here with some heritage interpretation of these steel inlays, picking up the rails that were in the floor before, across to this new curtain wall, these 12-foot by 12-foot sections of sliding curtain wall that allow for this kind of seamlessness between the courtyard and the kiln building, which formerly was about 18 inches to 2 feet less than the courtyard previously. There's a mass timber mezzanine envisioned kind of to embody the future cities space as future cities center, a kind of blue sky space that's vaulted up into the rafters of the building. You see that here in the section, hovering above the existing kilns, also providing a place of refuge for when the building floods, which it floods. It floods actively inside the building. They've had the 50-year flood, which is, you can see here on the top right, at about waist level. They've had that twice in the last 10 years. So it really highlights changing climatic conditions. The building itself is also, the approach is really premised on in-floor radiant heating and cooling in the floor, driving and an idea to affect people's perception of temperature and comfort, as opposed to this precise reading on the thermostat that is supported by solar thermal panels on the roof that are connected to geothermal panels in the ground, or geothermal loops, in the ground, which makes the building roughly 97% carbon neutral, and through the renovation process, avoided roughly 50% of the carbon emissions if you were to build this with all new materials. Here on the left is during construction, we used these displacement forms to avoid a lot of concrete that otherwise would have been put into the building, but also allow some of the nuisance flooding that is occurring to happen below this new floor. On the right, you see some of these steel inlays that are picking up the existing rails that were in the floor. Actually, you see some of these rails here. These used to move the bricks around, radiant heating and cooling. One notable thing about this building was this bathroom, which didn't seem so controversial to us at the time, but the building department took a big issue with it. And so what it is specifically is 21 toilets in an all-gender washroom configuration, where every one of these toilets has floor-to-ceiling solid walls, hollow metal doors, deadbolts, and then everyone shares a sink. And the building department responded to this by saying that we can do this, but not until we provide all the segregated male and female washrooms that were required, or that they perceived to be required first. And we had a long conversation about what was explicitly allowed or explicitly prohibited. And in the end, we got this built. But what it underscored is, for me, is the pervasiveness of a variety of barriers in a wide, just a lot of pervasive barriers that are institutionalized in many ways. And so responding to this, I took it upon myself to submit a change to the Ontario Building Code, which anybody can do, to write an extra line for how you can calculate bathroom provisions. And I take no credit for this. I stood on the shoulders of Joel Saunders, Susan Stryker, Terry Cogan, and their work through this fantastic organization, STALD, which is a US-based advocacy group on building code changes. They were instrumental in changing the International Building Code, and the work that I did also built off of writing that had been done, or the code changes that have been done in the Vancouver Code. This reference document, Design for Inclusivity by Hughes, Conn and Marler, Vancouver, is also a really great resource for designing this type of either multi-user washroom or all-gender change room. What this drives home, though, is for all of us as designers to recognize that, for better or for worse, the people who design the touch points of society determine who can participate and who's left out, often unwittingly, which Kat Holmes writes in Mismatch, How Inclusion Shapes Design. And she goes on to say, we must broaden our definition of design and designers. We must test our assumptions about human beings. We must wonder, who am I excluding, and allow the answers to change our solutions. Above all, we must be willing to acknowledge how much we don't know about inclusion. The cycle of exclusion culminates with solutions that we introduce into the world. At the same time that I was working on the Kiln Building, I picked up this book, The New Carbon Architecture by Bruce King, and went down a very deep rabbit hole on material impacts, carbon impacts of materials. At the same time, we were also sitting down with a new client for a kickoff meeting who asked, what if we build more buildings entirely from plant-based material? Or as Lloyd Alter would say, building out of sunshine. This is also on the mind of many others. Stephanie Carlisle, a principal at Kieran Timberlake, Philadelphia-based architects, wrote in Fast Company, "I'm polluting the planet for years. I'm not an oil exec, I'm an architect." And Jenna Levitt, principal of LGA, and myself were also, over the same kind of time, writing this series on designing climate change for Azure, looking and taking deep dives on issues from how zoning was affecting it and policy, to the need to decarbonize architecture through materials. And I think these kind of deep dives on our ability to change things and our responsibility as designers for where we are today kind of comes together in this image from Architecture 2030, which looks at global CO2 emissions by sector. In construction, it's all global CO2 emissions. And what it says to me is that how we build and where we build, the work of architects, planners, landscape architects, and even designers is driving climate change. The majority of the emissions are from these sources. And the World Health Organization says that climate change is the greatest threat to global health in the 21st century. They wrote this prior to COVID, so this may be a little bit different now, but it's still a really significant point. And more to the point, it's that connecting these dots, that how we build and where we build our work is one of the factors driving the greatest threat to global health in the 21st century. And this seems a little bit intangible, but we can start to look at an image like this from the New York Times, that this is specifically manifesting in things like wildfire, extreme drought, extreme heat, extreme rainfall, hurricane events, sea level rise. Looking at wildfires specifically, each year globally, between 260 and 600,000 people are dying from smoke from wildfires that is being driven in some part by climate change. This is in David Wallace Wells' book, The Uninhabitable Earth. It's a fantastic read, a little bit frightening, but fantastic nonetheless. And bringing this home, the Ontario Building Code has a series of objectives at the front, this being one of them. But an objective of the code is to limit the probability that as a result of the design or construction of a building, a person will be exposed to an unacceptable risk of injury due to fire. And I think we can strike the line in or adjacent to in this kind of context, but just understand that that the building codes ought to be trying to combat this more than they are, which is a serious thing that we need to confront next with the policy documents we have. Well, a dozen or so of these objectives at the beginning of the building code specifically to talk to in or adjacent to. This one, interestingly, does not. And so an objective of the code is to limit the probability that as a result of the design or construction of a building, a person will be exposed to an unacceptable risk of illness. And where that starts to come home is that, we look at asthma that's being exacerbated by climate change. People are dying from it. That the disease vectors are being altered. And what that is like you take, for instance, that ticks have migrated north. And now Lyme's disease is a problem in Ontario where it wasn't before. Heat stroke, heat waves, malnutrition due to crop failure, water scarcity issues are all being driven by this. And either by action or inaction through fault or ignorance, we've designed the world to behave exactly as it's behaving right now. And it's what writes Mike Monteiro in Ruined by Design, How Designers Destroyed the World and What We Can Do to Fix It. What's next? This is also from Architecture 2030 and has kind of become a touchstone for me in how I look at things these days. And so what we see is incrementally in the blue is energy emissions increasing cumulatively year after year after a building is constructed. That's what's getting bigger. The embodied carbon emissions or the material emissions of the building start out at the most they'll ever be. They are upfront, they're irreversible. That's why this yellow bar doesn't change. And historically, energy emissions over the life of the building outweigh material emissions, except when we look at the urgency of the International Panel on Climate Change Directive for carbon peak at 2030, 75% of emissions from now till 2030 will be driven by materials and not energy. When we factor in that buildings take a long time to build, or infrastructure as well, that the construction period and the approvals period for these projects of what will be constructed and finished by 2030 means that the majority of the design decisions that shape that are going to have nearly all of them will have been made by 2025, only a few years away. Importantly, while the material emissions are set, they're irreversible. Once you cast the concrete, the impact of that is gone. The energy emissions we still can alter into the future, either by adding renewables or looking at macro grid greening strategies. Where are these emissions coming from? How's this shaping our buildings? On the left here, large heavy buildings. In the middle, lighter footprint of small light buildings. This is fairly typical conditions. Every project is unique. Renovations, obviously much less on the right, but what is driving this is decisions on how we design our buildings in terms of foundation and structure, exterior cladding, interior finishes, work that designers and architects have a huge degree of agency over. We can choose extruded polystyrene insulation, or we can choose mineral batt insulation that is roughly 22 times less in impact for R value. And that's not even getting into what might be cast aside as hippie materials like dense packed cellulose or straw bale construction, which start with a material footprint sequestering. We bluntly and blindly use concrete. It's said to be the most destructive material on Earth, which is responsible for emitting roughly 8% of the world's CO2. Tomorrow, on any project that you're working on, you can use fly ash or slag in the mix design to reduce that impact. Use displacement forms like bubble deck, hollow core, or others to mitigate the impact and how you deploy it. Steve Webb of Webb Yates, an engineer in London, really drives this home that it's absolutely outrageous that an architect goes out and buys locally grown tomatoes at the supermarket, gets on their bike to work, thinks they're an environmentally conscious person while designing a concrete or steel frame building, and I would add one that's wrapped often in petrochemical insulation. I would also add that I think the same goes for arriving to studio to do the same thing in school. I would kind of bring this home in an example that I'm working on one building, one of many I will work on in my career. And for the below grade insulation, which we are doing more of than typical because we're looking to get a high energy performance outcome out of it. But the difference between choosing extruded polystyrene insulation or rock wool is roughly 130 tons of carbon. And that is roughly equivalent to me if I've done my math right, me becoming a vegetarian tomorrow for the rest of my life and my next 2 lifetimes. That 1/3 of the insulation of one small building that I'm working on is equivalent to that personal choice. It is really drives home that we need to be much more responsible in our decision-making, in our design, as we are in other aspects of our life. This is from Builders for Climate Action. On the left, we can choose to make buildings that are of high impact, highly emitting, using concrete, spray foam or XPS insulation, brick or other high impact claddings, or steel framing. On the very right, we can build a carbon sequestering building tomorrow with alternative concrete foundations. We can look at straw or wood fiber insulation, wood cladding, wood framing, and have major sequestering impacts. Some of the work I've been involved in lately includes this engineering innovation pavilion. It is a mass timber building. It's proposed with wood fiber insulation. It has a carbon neutral mechanical heating and cooling system. It is on steel pile foundations and sequesters 40 tons of carbon from its construction and emits nothing in its heating and cooling. This is a women's shelter I was involved in the kind of early schematic design stages, which also is using no conventional concrete foundation, helical piles as well. It is wood framed, it is foam free, and will be nearly passive house in terms of its energy level, so ultra low energy outcome. This project is Indigenous House at the University of Toronto Scarborough campus. It is a collaboration between LGA and Formline Architecture and Alfred Waugh. The lead architect for this from Formline will be speaking at U of T in March. I encourage everyone to listen. I'm sure I'll have more to say about this, but this project is a carbon neutral passive house equivalent building, also looking at a variety of natural building materials to lower its footprint. This project here, again, pursues similar ideas. It's an ecocultural repellent gathering place. It is looking at mass timber, low impact insulation choices, other natural materials. And I think it might be easy to say, these are a product of kind of unique project circumstances or whatnot. And I certainly have had some great opportunities with great clients. But on each of these projects, I would also say that I've actively tried to push these projects and these clients one step past their comfort zone, which in some ways I look at and think, if a client has come to me and said, I want to do 25% better than energy code for my building to get my funding, part of the conversation becomes, well, what about passive house? What if we go one step further and take it to passive house? Or if someone comes to me and says, hey, look, I want to do this carbon neutral pavilion building, and the conversation starts to be, well, what about carbon negative? Can we push it one step further? I think in order to do this, we have to be informed. We have to be able to we have to have done our research and homework beforehand. And it means making a lot of phone calls to suppliers, other designers, to builders. And I would speculate that I'm making calls like that every other week at least. to be able to make these kind of propositions. Recently, late last year, I took another opportunity to look at my thesis kind of through a new lens on embodied carbon. And if this work had concluded by speculating that we could accommodate all of the population growth forecasts for the region at the time in buildings not more than 6 stories, I thought, what choice did that lay out through this new embodied carbon lens? This is very rough napkin math from someone who is not wouldn't say that they're an expert math person, but I think I'm pretty close to the mark here. But if we were to build 500,000 units in the Greater Toronto Area, roughly 59 million square meters of construction in conventional towers, concrete, clad in aluminum, glass, we would be emitting somewhere around 25 million tons of carbon. Building these in 4-story, that kind of builders from climate action, the red one, the kind of high carbon building in 4 stories is still roughly 15 million tons of carbon emissions. But we can also choose tomorrow to make 4-story or roughly that carbon sequestering buildings that can sequester roughly 10 million tons of carbon emissions from the materials. I would end by reframing the quote I opened with, the Buckminster Fuller one, that success or failure of this planet of human beings depended on how you are, what you do, how would you be, what would you do? Because that's what I see as what's next. Thank you.
Thank you, Drew. That was fantastic. Thank you so much for your incredibly insightful and thought-provoking lecture. Not only did you show us some really great, thoughtful design work, you showed us the role that architects can have in shaping policy, which is arguably where we might be able to make more of an impact. Now we will open the floor to questions from everyone. You can drop your question in the chat for one of us to ask Drew, or if you'd like to ask your question directly, you can also let us know in the chat. We'll be going through questions chronologically. And we'll give everyone a moment to type in their questions, as I'm sure there will be many. But in the meantime, I'd like to ask you a question about the OBC change request. My intuition tells me that not too many architects would engage directly with policy in that way. And I'm wondering what led you to that point where you submitted the change request? Was it something you were already anticipating and something that you were already working on? I guess, how did you find the time to do that? And what advice might you have for other architects who might also want to engage with policy like that in that way?
I think that one thing that I've discovered from doing a number of projects that have been kind of published and received a lot of attention is that it's great to make exemplary projects, but I find that they actually don't change too much. Though you can start to have these really interesting conversations with people. You can phone up someone and say, hey, look, I'm learning all this about embodied carbon. Phone up the city and say, we got to start to change policy about embodied carbon. And specifically on the code change, my grandfather actually wrote the building code, which gave me a little bit of a unique insight to the ability to how the code was built originally, and then also really underscores that it's a very kind of evidence-based but somewhat arbitrary rule set that we subscribe to. And so there's these rules, but they can change, and it's why these things come out with new additions every couple of years. It's these constant changes, and it needs to keep up. And I, in fact, came across the work of Stalled while doing the all-gender bathroom at Evergreen, and recognized that they had been doing this code change work. And when we were confronted with this code change problem, I thought, well, I should follow what they do. And if there's one line in the code that we can change that will make this easier, we can just kind of simply rewrite the language that they're doing. Unfortunately, the Ontario Building Code said that they were not interested in making any changes at present. And so I'm working with someone else right now, and I'm trying to reformat that to a national building code change. Ontario's position was they're waiting to harmonize with the national level. And if they change it, then Ontario would follow suit. It's not difficult to write. It's a little bit of homework, but it's not too hard to do.
I actually have a follow-up question to that. It sounds like there is a bit of kind of resistance from at least the, were you saying the city level or the provincial level?
When we submitted the building permit, it was the plans examiner that turned it down, and we were able to work that out actually through really constructive conversation and figured out a way that they would accept it. But it was the provincial level that said no to the change request.
Mm-hmm. Do you find that you have to kind of play the game of like figuring out who to go to at what time, and like how, I guess, how do you go about that?
Yeah, I would say that one thing I learned from kind of studying planning is that there's like behind all of these rules, there's always some sort of objective or intent someone is trying to achieve. And often when I'm confronted with these rules on projects, you can kind of, you get these notices from the city and they say no for this reason or that reason. And there's usually, something that they're trying to achieve, which is why a number of projects that we've done at the office and both Evergreen and the EVA's projects, there's these alternative solution applications you can make to essentially demonstrate how you're complying without strictly meeting the rules of the building code. But it's usually through a lot of conversations and trying to connect dots between people saying like, you're okay with this and they're okay with this, both of you aren't okay unless the other person says it. Someone has to say it first, and setting up conference calls and things. There's a lot more negotiating in being an architect than they teach you in school or in being a landscape architect or planner.
Thank you. David, did you want to jump in?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Drew. Always a pleasure. Has it been almost 15 years that we've had these conversations? It's a real joy to see one's former student, now a valued friend and colleague, continuing to practice what I would call responsible architecture. You began your lecture with addressing issues of culture and gender and social responsibility. You quickly shifted into, shall we say, technology and materials, the act of making, and the necessity of policy approvals, all of which are part of practice and allow you to be a better and more responsible designer. But now I'd like to push you a little further, because in order to deliver not, let's drop the word affordable housing, but go back to what I think has always been your motivation, the right to housing, available housing rather than affordable housing. And if I can call it in this world of neoliberal late capitalism, the real problem is not whether we can build a better building, but in fact, how do we finance it? What is the responsibility? Because the wonderful ideas that emerged in your thesis with respect to policy, with respect to building, and the fact that you're going to revisit it, we'll get nowhere, even with improved policy in zoning, which or building code, which is difficult, if we still operate on conventional modes of avarice and greed and private ownership of land. So, my friend, how does one modify this system? And I'm not asking you to take to the barricades, or perhaps, but it's, where does our social and professional responsibility as architects lie in being able to push those agendas? And sorry to push you over the boundary, but I think it's important and you can handle it.
Yeah, it's really, really tricky. I don't know. I don't have a good answer, I don't think. But the thing that strikes me is that too often policymakers are looking at a small subset of sites that are available and looking at building them in a way looking at building them and financing them through, in particular right now, the private market. That we're looking at developers as people who should be building affordable housing when there's not an alignment of interests. The reason a developer is going to build private or build public housing is because they can make money, which is not a kind of the same interest that I think the public should have in building public housing. But if we limit ourselves to just looking at these, conventional sites and conventional building types, we're really casting aside a huge amount of sites that could otherwise be built, whether that is, transforming warehouse buildings or other underutilized sites, or looking simply at smaller sites that are often cast aside as undevelopable. And in looking at these, low-rise, high-density housing types that I was kind of exploring in my thesis, I think one of the conclusions I came to is that these typologies, which fit, like downtown is like 10% of the entire land area of the region. 90% of the sites are conducive to building these 4 to 6 story high-density buildings, and they allow for a pro forma based on lower cost wood frame construction, which I think ultimately would would allow for new co-ops or co-housing schemes like this to form. It doesn't take a lot for a dozen or so families to build a 12-unit, small multi-unit out of wood and find land to do that. It's an entirely different proposition from building a 30-story affordable housing project.
Yeah, perhaps as a follow-up, if I may, we actually had it right in Canada 50 years ago. And whether or not you admired the buildings at a development such as St. Lawrence, the land was never part of the pro forma. The land is still owned by the Crown, by the federal government. And this is where I think it speaks to, is because even, for example, all the Toronto housing or the Build Toronto, the public sector still uses the same pro forma that the private sector does. Now, whether they're looking for the same profit margin, and one might equate it to the same problematics that have occurred and made manifest by the pandemic in long-term care, where the for-profit model demonstrates that something has been added to what must be a basic societal right and responsibility, as must be housing, that in fact we can deliver. And we had it right here under Trudeau the Elder when we had a federal ministry of housing and urban affairs. Now, I'm not arguing for the same policies of 50 years ago, but we can look back in order to look forward. And I think your work always has. And, I'd really say to all the students who are listening, what's been most interesting about Drew is he's never accepted when somebody said, oh, this is the way you have to do it. And it's always been, well, have you thought about it this way? Here are the opportunities. And in that sense, he's a real exemplar and deserves all the credit he has been given. And I continue to look forward to his future work.
Thank you. Thank you for the kind words, David.
Thank you, David. I had another question, I guess more so about like finding your workplace and a place that also cares about inclusivity or sustainability, and that, makes sure that they consider in their work. And I was wondering if, I guess along those lines of like, how do you find a place like that? If you think that will needs to come from leadership as much as it comes from the designer, or if you think the designer can kind of just infiltrate the system and the workplace and do it on their own.
I think it can be both. I mean, I have been very fortunate in arriving at LGA in particular. We've been for the last 7 years, and it very much is that environment. It is extremely fostering. It is extremely encouraging and supportive to the staff, and gives us some latitude to pursue our interests and make sure all our voices are heard. I think that the other part of that is that wherever you end up, to some extent, I think for me, it's been, looking for places where I think my voice would be heard. And if I come across a place that I don't think that's going to happen, I've not ever tried to go work for that. And I think that, the more that people stop working for those places where their voices aren't heard, the more it will kind of force those places to change. I mean, that being said, that's the perspective from a white dude. So, it's, I recognize that that's not the experience that a lot of people have had. But I think that it's, I think that it's about finding a place that your voice will be heard. And, in some of these issues too, like, advancing ideas about sustainability, there are things you can do. You can choose to design a wall with insulation that's XPS, or choose to design it with Roxel, and you can kind of infiltrate the design process without even having to ask that. You don't have to go ask someone who's running the practice, can I do it this way or this way? It's, the wall needs insulation, I did it this way, and it's not necessarily a conversation. But, I think that practices need to change. I think there's a lot of great organizations and groups out there trying to push practices and design practice to change, and really accept a lot of voices that are not like mine into the industry. And I think that that's a phenomenal thing. And it's important that people like me sometimes stop and just listen.
Another question I had, unless there are any questions in the chat, if anyone wants to ask, I guess it's kind of about the process of it. You kind of make it sound easy, or not easy, but just doable to, create all these changes and change policy and make changes to the building code. But I have a feeling that it could also be very frustrating, and it's probably a very long process. And I guess I'm wondering, how do you sustain the motivation and like energy to partake in these efforts?
Yeah, sorry, the water went down the wrong way. Yeah, I think it's, there's certainly been times where I found it very hard to kind of maintain the motivation for doing it. In part, I also feel like until there's a huge chorus of voices kind of fighting to make these changes, and I know there's a lot of voices out there, but I feel like, all of us have to kind of sustain the fight. And, in some ways, I think especially on the sustainability front, my background is as an urban planner and as an architect. And I look at that chart that says that, where and how we build is driving climate change. And I have 2 little kids. And I suppose that a lot of my motivation is sustained by the fact that I feel like one day they will grow up and they will say, Dad, your industry is responsible for a lot of this. What did you do? And I want to be able to say to them, I did everything I possibly could think of doing every single day. And, here we are, for better or for worse. And so I certainly draw a lot of motivation from that, but it's not necessarily as easy as I make it out to be. I admit that freely. And, I think part of it is like, when a client says, no, I'm not interested in that, it's like, okay, well, let's come up with something else interesting. The wood Pavilion building prior to that scheme was an air bubble building using pneumatic tube structure, which had a very low impact. There's this amazing company, Dynamic Air, that makes these things out of Alberta and actually in Newfoundland. They make in both places. But we had looked at a building like that to be this kind of temporary light footprint building that had solar cells stitched into it, and the client didn't want to be the first air bubble building people. And so, we pivoted and took what they were interested in and found another kind of vehicle for that. So, there's setbacks. There's lots of setbacks. When the building department, or when the Ontario Building Code Division, said they weren't interested in the code change I submitted, it was certainly, defeating. But their answer was, when the national code changed. It's like, okay, so we'll just change the wording for all the OBC clauses to MBC clauses. So.
Thank you.
I have a quick question. I don't see one in the chat. I'm curious about if you can speak to perhaps the agency that students might have in demanding or demanding, I mean, suggesting change to curriculums to kind of address some of these issues, I mean, all of the things that you're kind of interested in, but I guess, yeah, I'm in a studio right now that has to do with embodied carbon, as you know. Demanding, yes, thanks, Randa. Yeah, can you just speak to the agency or like the actions that you think students might be able to take to see the changes they would like to see made?
Yeah, I mean, I'm of two minds. I think that, you know, to some extent you can ask for things and they're going to happen. I mean, it's like everything, like sometimes they'll happen, sometimes they won't. But, you know, if we're not asking, or, you know, when I was a student, like if I wasn't asking for things, then they weren't going to happen. You know, if I didn't ask to be in the urban design course that was restricted to urban design students, I wasn't going to be in that course. And so I think part of it is kind of putting your voices out there and using your voices. Like, to some extent, the faculty and the school exists and is, you know, there's a research agenda certainly, but there's also the agenda of educating young students, and the material needs to be timely. You know, telling them what's important to you is the kind of first start to it. I think there's another part of it, which is, you know, in my view, I took my options studios and I kind of co-opted them to what I was interested in. And I think there's some latitude in every project that you're given to do just that. Like a lot of essay assignments are not telling you specifically what you have to write about. I know that for one of my studio projects in particular, we were given a site downtown, and I, you know, talked to the options studio prof, and I said, you know, I get what you're trying to do. I really appreciate it. I'm way more interested in the challenge of this topic in the suburbs as opposed to this downtown site on lowering carbon footprints. You know, would you mind if I did the same assignment but just picked a different site? And you know, I was very happy that they said yes. But, you know, if I didn't ask, it wasn't going to happen. And I think that's kind of been a kind of mindset I've had since I was, you know, since I was a little kid. I've always asked for things like that. You know, just kind of done it. Get said no to a lot of times, but.
Great, and thank you, Drew. And we're coming up on 8 o'clock here, so I just wanted to give a chance to any students who wanted to ask a question. You can just unmute yourself and ask it now. This is your last chance. Otherwise, I've got a question here for you as well, Drew. As sort of closing remarks here, what advice might you have for students who are about to enter the workplace or thinking about their future after school? What did you learn when you started working in the field that surprised you, that you didn't expect when you were still in school?
The things that surprised me about getting into practice that I didn't expect from school is how much work and time you would spend negotiating things, or you know, even just the process of the business side of the industry. You know, getting work, you know, managing project budgets, and these types of just process-oriented things that are touched upon, but not necessarily you're not necessarily exposed to. And I think also the kind of major gear shift from, I think, an environment that often often uplifts individuals in school, and it's like, you know, it's some person's idea who had this, you know, pivotal role in shaping a project, and it's in practice it's a team effort. Like all of these projects I've worked on, there's a whole team in all of these. You know, it's not just me doing these things on my own type of thing. And I would say that, you know, my advice would really be first, like, you know, push your time at Daniels to its fullest. Fight to be in the courses you want, fight to study the things that you want to study. You know, it's not going to happen if you're not asking for it. And then secondly, I think, like, you know, when you're going out to find a job, you know, if you can't bring experience, like, bring perspective. You know, having new fresh perspectives in our office is hugely valuable. You know, even if people aren't experienced, having that perspective that's different is invaluable. And that perspective can be anything, you know, whether it's life experience, you know, a different way of looking at things, you know, understanding embodied carbon and asking a whole series of different questions than what an office is working on or thinking about right now. Like, you know, personally, I'm super interested in embodied carbon. And I would like nothing more than, you know, 100 graduating architects to go to 100 different offices and start asking 100 different principles and practices. What are you doing about embodied carbon? because those questions can come up and really start to reshape how we practice. But, you know, it's about kind of finding a space where your voice is valued, whatever that might be, and whatever you might have to say, and whatever perspective you might bring to offer. Because at the end of the day, like, every person on every project can make a difference, you know, one little change and thing at a time. And, you know, as much as I want sweeping change for everything to be different, it kind of happens really incrementally.
That's really great. Thank you, Drew. Thank you for your time here tonight.
Thank you.
All right, 8 on the dot. Very punctual group. Yeah, Drew, thank you so much. This was, I guess, the second time. I mean, I know we've kind of been in contact since the fall, and I feel like everything was new and fresh and really interesting. So I appreciate that very much. We did pop a little link in the chat for some feedback. If anyone has any and you have a couple minutes to complete that, we'd appreciate hearing, as this is the first year that we're doing this. Drew, we would love if you have any peers that you think, you know, would be interested in participating in this kind of discussion with students. We'd love to get those names as well.
Yeah.
And yeah, otherwise, thanks everyone for coming, and for David for your questions. And otherwise, have a great night.
I would just say also just that my email's at the bottom. So if people have questions about the projects, I'm happy to discuss further.
Right. I'll leave the slide up here for a second so people can take a snip or whatever you need to do.
Jules, should we say goodbye to the live stream?
I'm going to say goodbye to the live stream. I know I always forget to, and then we have the after.